Welcome to Sidewalk News Roundtable. This panel launches an independent series of discussions hosted by New York City's ethnic and community media journalists. Sidewalk News Roundtables will tap this important media sector, giving editors and journalists the space to share their analysis and perspectives on a broad range of community issues and the impact of municipal, state, and federal policies here in New York City. In collaboration with Manhattan Neighborhood Network, we will then share our roundtables with public access television stations and independent media nationwide. Joining us as our audience and questioners are youth media journalists, forging ties among the generations of community communicators. My name is David Galalza. I will be your moderator today. I am Communications Specialist for CSCA Local 1000, a public sector union representing workers throughout the state of New York. I also work on many local social justice and environmental issues. In this, our premier program, we focus on environmental challenges in New York City. Communities here are taking action to challenge environmental toxins and climate change both here and in their home countries. Journalists and advocates will identify issues of environmental degradation that are not getting media attention and discuss the impact of current policy. Joining us today, and we're happy to have them here, are Ogunaya Dotson-Newman, who is the director of We Act, an organization in Harlem. We also have with us today Catherine Bagley, a reporter for the Pulitzer Prize-winning Inside Climate News, which is based in Brooklyn, New York, and she's also the co-author of a book called Bloomberg's Hidden Legacy, Climate Change and the Future of New York City. Also with us today is Dr. Partha Banerjee. He's an educator, blogger, and contributor to Thikana, and also a human rights activist. He's with the largest Bangladeshi newspaper in New York City. And then we also have Rang Xiaoping, an award-winning reporter with the Chinese Singtao Daily and a former staff writer with the magazine City Limits. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I think we'd start off with a couple of questions to the panelists, and then please, feel free to inject your thoughts on any of these, wide-ranging issues having to do with the environment and climate change. We're at a historic moment here in New York City, obviously, with the upcoming People's Climate March and the meetings that are going to be taking place at the United Nations. So I wanted to ask Dr. Partha Banerjee, given his varied background, and you could touch briefly on the kinds of things you've done in the past in academia and labor and activism, how has this background prepared you, and the training that you've received prepared you to address issues of climate change with the different constituency groups that you've been involved with or have worked with?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. It's an extremely important time in history. My own background, first I was a biologist for a long time, and then I started working first as immigrant rights activist after 9/11, and then moved on to work also with the labor community, organized labor community. And all these different backgrounds really have helped me to see the problems that the underprivileged communities in particular are faced with, both in New York City and all across the United States, but not just in the United States, all over the world. And my own personal life in Bengal, in Calcutta, I've actually seen how environmental change and climate change and global warming are devastating communities, both from their economic point of view and also from their social and political point of view. So it's really a very, very important time, and we are all looking forward to the September 21st People's Climate March that's going to happen in New York City.
Excellent. Well, Ogunaya, We Act actually is in a community right now, and we're happy to be at this studio in East Harlem that has been gravely impacted by a number of environmental factors, both man-made and natural. Mm-hmm. Can you address some of the issues that have affected the folks that live in this community and the kind of work that We Act's been doing?
Yeah, definitely. So I wanted to thank you for being here, and I'm really honored and privileged to sit next to all of these esteemed journalists next to me. I am actually the Director of Environmental Health at We Act for Environmental Justice, and it Also, the thing I think that's interesting about that is that I work directly with our executive director and co-founder, Ms. Peggy Shepard, who has been with the organization since its inception, which started around a fight related to the North River sewage treatment plant. And so one of the things that I think is really interesting about We Act, West Harlem Environmental Action, or We Act for Environmental Justice, is that we do work that really connects the things that we're all exposed to in our everyday environment. So defining the environment the same way that the environmental justice movement does, which is where we live, work, play, and pray, and really understanding that people here in this neighborhood and community feel things and when they're exposed to whatever may be in terms of like outdoor air quality. So we're right around the corner from 100th Street Bus Depot, which we worked with residents of East Harlem to try and at least deal with some of the issues related to that.
Can you talk about some of the issues? Because this is also a huge asthma concern.
Yeah, so what we find is that usually asthma is directly connected, or the evidence supports that it's connected to outdoor air quality. But if you look at some of the numbers that have been put up through the New York City Community Air Survey, you find that air quality is really bad here in East Harlem, in the South Bronx, but also on the Upper East Side, which borders right where we are located right now in the studio. And so what are some of the driving factors that may be leading to health disparities? Why is it that asthma is 3 times higher here in East Harlem versus people that are 10 blocks away in the Upper East Side? And so we believe that part of those driving factors are not just the outdoor air quality, but what's inside. So access to clean environment, making sure that there's no mold inside, cockroach infestations and things that happen in dilapidated housing, which oftentimes are exposures that people of color and low income are predisposed to because of their access to, I guess, privileges and class and things like that. And then also thinking about where are we? Like, is this a food desert? Is there access? Is the neighborhood safe and clean where people can work out and do things outside? So trying to think about the interconnections between those. And so if there is a bus depot across the street from what you see very close to us, a school and a neighborhood, are there other things that can really do to address that can be a protective factor instead? And is there access to, I guess, healthcare and other things like that to make sure that people are also receiving the services that they need? So you have access to quality food, access to safe places for people to play and to move. You have the quality of the air outside, the quality of the air inside, and how do all of those come together to really be able to make sure that you're getting health outcomes that are similar to neighborhood that's basically 10 blocks away. Does that?
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. I just wanted to make sure I was
feel
clear.
free, by all means, panelists too, to chime in or add additional thoughts to whatever each of you are chiming in on or talking about. Ron, you covered extensively post-Sandy, obviously in Chinatown for your newspaper, and you have experience in dealing with community groups, organizations, individuals that were devastated by this particular storm. Tell us some more about your interactions, how people are finally really viewing this within the lens of it's not just a storm, it's a superstorm, and it's caused by environmental factors.
Yeah, one thing I found very interesting is probably in the mainstream community that there are some people who are still skeptical to the idea of climate change. But in the Chinese community, almost everybody believes this is true because it really affects our community and it happened in our life. Hurricane Sandy is a very good example. And this is like we're talking about Chinatown. This is a community that was affected a lot by September 11th. And it has been recovering, but still not there yet. And then Hurricane Sandy. And during Sandy, there were like 5 days, no electricity. The whole Chinatown is almost like shut up. Like there's no transportation, no electricity. And Confucius Plaza, that's the biggest housing complex in Chinatown. There are 2,000, 3,000 senior people living in that building. A lot of them living on higher floors. So during that 5 days, they couldn't go downstairs. They couldn't go out to buy anything. They had to. They're totally stuck in their apartment. There were a lot of volunteers worked to help them. They lift the water and food and gave them send supplies to seniors. That was actually a touching scene. And then after Sandy, during the recovering process, I heard a lot of talking that what are we going to do to do better next time, because everyone believes things like this will happen again because of the entire climate change.
And that's a perfect segue to get to Kat and perhaps some of the policies and innovations, or sort of like the imprint that the former mayor Bloomberg left for us post Sandy. Even before Sandy, there was a lot of work being done, to the extent that I believe in the conversations that we've had, there's kind of like a blueprint, or at least some models that exist that are even attractive to other municipalities and states throughout the country. Could you share some of that?
Sure. So again, thanks for having me. And the Bloomberg administration started working on climate change back in 2005, way before a lot of other communities were looking at it. And they framed it in kind of a sustainability lens, focusing on improving or increasing green spaces, improving air quality, things that have public health initiatives. And as the plan was updated and grew over the course of his 3 terms, climate change was being, was a bigger part of that plan, reducing the CO2 emissions that the city releases, things like cleaner energy for heating systems for buildings, and the parks that have been built recently, for example, Brooklyn Bridge Park, is meant to withstand a storm like Superstorm Sandy. And if you walked down into that park after Sandy hit, it looked generally like it always did, because you had furniture that's bolted into place, and you have landscape that is meant to be inundated with water. And so when the water receded, the park looked the same. But the problem was that Sandy, for years the Bloomberg administration had spent time working on reducing emissions and not enough time on the adaptation projects. And so that's what kind of came after Sandy, with the public really pushing, saying, oh my gosh, climate change is really going to be affecting New York. We need to do something. And so they released this giant $20 billion plan, I think it was 6 months after Sandy hit. And the problem is that the mayor only had a couple more months in office, and which means that the majority of the adaptation work that will go into protecting New York communities from climate change will fall to the de Blasio administration and future administrations. This is a long-term project that we're taking on, and what's happened in New York City is largely seen. Even though it does, there is definitely room for improvement, it is largely seen as a blueprint for other cities, both within the U.S. and also internationally. There's kind of a consensus that nobody has done more on tackling climate change than New York City, which says a lot considering how much more New York City has to do.
Can we all get an opportunity to chime in on some of that? Because how do we tie some of these local things to the national movement?
Sure. I'm not really... although I don't know all the nitty-gritty aspects of these plans, but I've lived in New York for a very long time, and actually worked with the immigrant community after 9/11 and saw the destruction of the communities, both from a political point of view and also from an economic point of view. One of the things that I've always noticed is the lack of preparation for such disasters. Of course, 9/11 was really something unprecedented, extremely large scale. But then even after that happened, to see how the communities, particularly the poor people, people of color, immigrant communities, and all the underprivileged groups in the city, how they were impacted by the aftermath of 9/11. I really haven't seen any plan of action coming out of that unfortunate saga. And likewise, the reason I'm mentioning that is that 9/11 is around the corner, so we are going to have 13 years of that tragedy. And even after 13 years, what it actually has the city done to proactively do something so that, God forbid, something like that happens again. What's gonna happen differently to the people who were impacted by the disaster, both on that day and many, many months and years after that. And likewise, climate change is a disaster that is happening in front of our eyes, and many people simply do not even understand the devastating impact of it. And when something like Sandy happens, when something like Katrina happens, then we go back and reflect on ourselves. Wow, look at it. So this is really real. We always thought that this could not happen in a rich country like America or a rich city like New York. Well, lo and behold, it's happening right in our backyard. So there has to be an organic, systemic way so that there is a future plan of action coming out of these lessons that we have learned over the years. And I really haven't seen that taking place, both when we look at a disaster like 9/11 or look at a much bigger global disaster such as climate change and global warming.
So I just want to say, I think one thing that also kind of like sparks my interest is, so part of the work that we do at WeAct is sometimes we'll work on projects called Photo Voice, where you use photos to get community residents to talk about things that they see. And so we did this with a group of older adults in Washington Heights related to kind of a community resilience project related to sea level rise. And one thing that was fascinating is when we asked them kind of like what they thought about climate change or to take pictures of climate change, there was kind of like this very nuanced understanding about what climate change would mean in terms of like broad concept of our changing kind of like overall climate, and then how that related to seasonal change. Because when you talk to people, they tell you about trends and things that they've seen that are different over the course of their lives here in New York City. And then they also want to understand and really be able to figure out how they can access ways to be resilient. So a lot of the neighborhoods here in northern Manhattan, they're neighborhoods that are built on that resiliency because they've been through a number of different changes that relate to kind of like the survival of people here. And so I think because climate change does disproportionately impact people of color and low income, I think what people are trying to figure out is what are the certain systems that are already in place, either that were put in place by the Bloomberg administration that maybe they want to see in place through the Office of Public Health and Emergency Response. So you have folks in East Harlem here, right, that are training with their community emergency response teams or CERT teams to be able to understand like how people can have a go bag. How, if you don't have necessarily people that you can use to be able to get out of the city if like an unexpected event comes up, what kind of other network or ties that you may have to your neighbors. And so it's interesting because one thing that WeAct has also done is looking at and really interviewing, going to start to interview residents that were in some public housing units and understand like what happened during Hurricane Sandy in like Red Hook and Coney Island and the Rockaways, and what are some of the things that sometimes need to be created to convince people, because the year before Sandy there was Hurricane Irene. And so NYCHA went out and told people to get everything ready, and a lot of folks left and kind of like disrupted whatever they were doing, and then nothing happened. So I think, it's kind of like us combating what happens naturally in terms of human nature, really listening to what people have to say, because a lot of times people are talking about climate change, they're just not using the language that we're used to as scientists, and finding where we can have the bridge in order to be able to implement, I think, these plans locally, and also not necessarily like build on the backs of people of color and low income, because I think that's what happens domestically and internationally is, there's this huge call about how are we going to put together like a climate change resilience or response plan, and how are we going to tell people like maybe that they could recycle or do large things in terms of like benchmarking with buildings, but then how are we also going to take maybe some of the fines that have been created for some of the buildings that are like out of compliance with their benchmarking, and then reinvest those into communities and neighborhoods so that the people that are disproportionately impacted can figure out a way to also address the problem.
Excellent.
Well, and I think one of the things that you see is if you put a map of where Sandy flooded the worst in New York City, those are low-income neighborhoods, basically, all of it. And if you place that map over a historical map of New York City, it's because all of those were built over wetlands, filled in. And so, I think the city needs to, do better in terms of a better kind of disaster preparedness plan. But it's it's going to be large scale projects that deal with these, because it's not like you can relocate thousands of people.
Or some people don't want to be relocated.
And they don't want to be relocated.
People have also systemically been driven to, right?
Yeah, I mean,
because
if we go back to Katrina, I mean, they unfortunately used that instance to relocate thousands of people.
Yeah.
So it does get into a problematic realm as well.
They're not going to move.
Yeah.
They like some of the Chinatown folks, like the seniors, they have been there for decades. They can't survive anywhere else. I think another thing that I'd like to mention is every time after this kind of disaster, the federal aids, we do get a lot of aids, but the red tapes, it's never getting better. Time after time, September 11th, and then Sandy, people in our community are frustrated because they had to fill so many forms and eventually get nothing. I think in terms of preparation for the next time, I think people need to think about this as well.
Yeah.
And so in a few weeks, we're expecting, hopefully, tens of thousands of people to be out in the streets here in New York City for this big People's Climate March preceding the big UN meetings on the climate. And one of the bigger concerns is, how are we going to draw people from our communities out to this march? How do we educate them? And how do we get them engaged in this conversation? What are sort of some of the things that you've been doing to drive this?
Well, I've been involved with organizational meetings for months now. I work for labor union, and I'm attending those meetings. And it's not just the labor community or the immigrant community. It's like the faith-based community, the women's groups, the environmental groups, of course, the Blue-Green Alliance and 350.org, and all these national groups, international groups are participating. And the last time I spoke with one of the lead organizers, she told me that as of this Labor Day, 1,000 plus organizations have actually endorsed this march, including almost 100 labor unions, which is unprecedented. I've never ever seen this type of alliance building happening. Maybe when we marched in the middle of February, minus 15 degrees, to protest against the Iraq war. That was probably the last time we saw something like that. But this is unprecedented. This is really, really warms my heart that something like this is happening, and people are from all walks of life. Men, women, and children and families, they are all coming together. And the youth contingent...
And so how are you making that connection between what's happening here locally and what's happening, say, back home, and why we need to be engaged in both places?
See, one of the things that in my own small way, I teach a labor workshop, and we've included climate change, global warming element in that workshop this year. And I'm telling people that you really have to connect people's day-to-day problems with this bigger, grandiose concepts that many people outside of the scientific community perhaps really do not understand. As you rightly pointed out, like, is there a direct day-to-day connection between climate change, global warming with healthcare? Is there a direct correlation with immigration? Is there a correlation with public transportation? Is there a correlation with some of the things that we take for granted? So unless you connect these dots and make this direct connection between these grandiose concepts with people's day-to-day problems and plights, people are not going to be drawn into this movement. So that is what people are actually doing right now, and that is why we're getting so much response in a very, very positive way. And I think that the September 21st march is going to be really big and historic.
I think it's also like they're taking this principle of thinking globally and acting locally very much to heart. So you have, depending on who you're connected with, so I work at We Act. We have a number of different organizations that we've been working with here uptown above 96th Street, so that there's like a climate justice teach-in. A lot of different groups are doing teach-ins all over the city, and the reason why I think that's important is because it also allows you to have the opportunity to have an engaged audience and really know what the carrot is that's going to bring them in, so that if the group of people is really worried about public transportation and climate change related to public transportation, which anyone in New York City can deal with, because as soon as you get on the train, they're talking about issues with signals and congestion, and a lot of that is related to saltwater, right? what is it?
Corrosion.
Corrosion, thank you. Saltwater corrosion that when tunnels were inundated. And so you have groups that are working in Sunset Park, like Uprose, to engage youth around teaching. I think they're having like a art making celebration tomorrow. You have organizations that also work, I think, nationwide that have been really partnering with some of the larger green groups like Greenpeace to be able to also filter down, which I think is important, is funding to support the capacity to be able to bring people to a march like this. And so I know that, like, for us at We Act, and then for other, I think, environmental justice organizations in the city, as I would expect maybe for organizations that you all might also be participating with, is it gives you the opportunity to understand it from your point of view or your lens, and then bring that into kind of like this big pot, which will be the climate march, and then also thinking about what happens after. So how do we do coalition building and community organizing to put pressure on our elected officials to ensure that they're actually implementing some of the plans that we're talking about in terms of, like, you know, building seawalls, developing plans to be able to support people to be more resilient.
I think you mentioned the home country effect. I think that's a very important factor to the Chinese community, because normally for something like climate change march, you won't see many people from Chinatown participating, because, you know, understandably people are so busy. They're you know, like jumping between 3 jobs or something like that. So they're not gonna do something that won't have immediate effect in their own life. But now what happened in China is environmental issues are such a big issue in China. And middle-class people who have money and have power, not political power, but economic power, are tired of the air pollution and all that kind of things. In our culture, protesting, marching, that's not part of our culture because of the political environment, the circumstances in China. But now you see that more and more, they don't call it march, they call it walk. You know, if, say, in a city, if the government want to place a polluted chemical plant there, you'll see people organize this kind of a walk. They're gonna just walk on the street without saying anything, but to give the government some pressure. And things started to change because of those walks. So now you see that environmental issues are kind of like a linchpin to change China a little bit, and put the idea of like we can change things to people's mind. So when China is changing and the immigrants here, because now these days with all the social media platforms, people connected with each other so closely. So people here, when they see what happened in China, they realize, oh, we can do this as well. So I think there is this interaction between the diasporas here and people in China.
I'd also like to add, I think, you know, New York City is very lucky in the fact that they have very hyper-local climate projections that have been done for the city from the New York City Panel on Climate Change. And so because of that, we're able to see very clearly how kind of New York City will be affected by climate change. And there's some really powerful numbers that, you know, people that I've talked to get really affected by things like by mid-century, the number of days that are going to be above 90 degrees will jump from 18 to 57. And I mean, people that live through New York City summers know that it's hot enough now. We don't need 57 days above 90 degrees.
Would you get that information?
It's the New York City Panel on Climate Change. Okay. And what they've done is they've taken the IPCC reports and they've kind of narrowed them down to a much smaller area, and so you're able to look at exactly how New York City is going to be affected by climate change. And those reports have gone into all of the work that the administrations have done, informing them the projects that need to be built. You have, by 2050, a quarter of the city is going to be in the floodplain. That's hugely impactful as well. You have, by 2050, sea level rise could be as much as 24 inches. We've had 7 inches in the last century. We're going to have another 24 potentially. And that's not even the most extreme estimate projection. That's just kind of the medium projection. So, you know, my conversations with people, you know, when you say these numbers, they really kind of go, oh my gosh, like, whoa, I get this is going to be really big. This is going to affect us a lot. And I've seen, you know, in terms of the number of New Yorkers, all the disparate interests from New York that are coming out for the march, you know, one of the reasons is that they're very aware of how all the different ways that New York is going to be impacted. So, you know, this is very personal for them.
Yeah, if, just to piggyback on that, you know, like some of the countries, first of all, many people think that, well, even if it is real, it is really poor people's problem, third world problem. Well, not really. I mean, just a few years ago, earlier in France, there was, I think it was like 2003 or 2004, something like that, when within like a couple of weeks, 10,000 French people died, perished because of extreme heat. And that was the first time when they like woke up, wow, what's happening? We never thought this would happen in a country like France. So that's not really a poor country's problem or poor people's problem somewhere else anymore. But talking about poor people's problem somewhere else, you know, like the scientists are conservatively predicting 4 to 7 degrees warmer planet within the next century. And by some very conservative predictions, if there is a 3 degrees warm planet within the next century, then countries such as Bangladesh and West Bengal and Burma, these places are not going to be on the map of the planet anymore. That is how serious that is. That's the Eastern Hemisphere. The Western Hemisphere, you have similar countries where they're going to be completely inundated with a rising tide of the sea.
Well, you also, you know, one of the examples is if you have, for example, really high heat and a drought like the U.S. is having right now, that has economic implications in the U.S., but you're not hearing about widespread deaths happening. But if that were to happen in Sudan, it's going to cause, you know, massive amount of deaths. So, you know, I think people are slowly starting to grasp the implications of this, and I don't know, I'm hoping that we're seeing a kind of a shift in public opinion and interest.
Well, a few years ago, you guys remind me this, a few years ago, I was there to cover the UN summit, that when all the presidents and prime ministers from different countries gathered together, they do speech. I was there, and I think the first one who did speech was Obama, President Obama, and then China was probably the third or the fifth. There were so many people. The hall was packed to listen to these two. And then in the noontime, I think it's the president of Maldives, you know, that small island country that almost being...
Maldives.
Yeah, right. It's disappearing now. You know, the room was almost empty. Only at most half of those audience left to listen to him.
Ron, you bring up a critical point too. It's that seems to be happening internationally and locally, which is when it comes to poor people, people of color throughout the world, they get short shrift, or they don't get the kind of attention that they deserve, and they're the ones that are most vulnerable. How do we reverse that? How do we engage our communities to demand that they be covered in the ways that they should be covered? And for instance, you work for a Pulitzer Prize-winning publication. There aren't environmental beats to name these days, and most newspapers, like, they don't have a labor beat. How do we get the media to really treat this as a serious topic that it is?
I think the march is going to be the first big step. You know, if everybody shows up that says that they're going to show up, I think it'll make a big impact, and I think the media will be forced to listen. One of the things that I think will be interesting is that the march actually walks right past the Fox News station. It's going to be interesting to see what Fox News chooses to show on that day, because they have the glass windows, you know, that overlook the street. And I think, you know, there needs to be this kind of people-powered movement for world leaders to start paying attention. But how you get there, I don't know. I think, you know, my opinion is just.
Yeah, I also think there's like interesting work going on where people are trying to use like university endowments in terms of divestment to be able to put an impact on folks. And so I think, you know, it's like there is like an interesting, unique opportunity, right, to have kind of like more mainstream green groups kind of partner with environmental justice groups and other folks that have been working kind of like at the cross section of all these, to be able to look at different mechanisms for you to be able to impact either, because most of this is right about like getting kind of like, well, really it's about like getting at the root of like capitalism and figuring out a way that you can kind of like create a paradigm shift to be able to move people directly to actually caring really essentially about people over profits, or our planet over profits. And so I think that, you know, when you have kind of like certain structures in the place and organizations that are like using, you know, sometimes their policy power or leverage, their people power and leverage, to be able to look at either like how can a university divest from investing in like specific types of, I guess, investments that they have, or how can we start to utilize some of our influence with people in Northern Manhattan to be able to put pressure on like their city council and local elected officials that then sometimes at times can trickle up or trickle down depending on where you are, where you're doing your organizing around creating change. Because I think, you know, some of this is also at like the federal level and looking at like the Clean Air Act and how we can begin to be able to put more protective regulations in place around you know, the rules regarding like power plants, new and old power plants. And so I think when you look at it at like, you know, impacting these various different levels and areas, you begin to start to see like this larger picture. Because I know that one of my colleagues, she works on like federal regulations, and so there's been a lot of environmental groups that have been getting people to go out to hearings, because the EPA has to have hearings when they're changing federal regulations, and getting folks to even put like their comments on the record. Because a lot of times, most of the comments that are on the record at the federal, state, or even sometimes local level, when you're playing in a pool like New York City, you find regulation is overrepresented, right? They have a lot of money to like put people there. And so, you know, figuring out all of these different leverage points that I think we all have, and then playing on kind of like, you know, whatever people are best at. So there's some people that are going to be good at federal policies. Some folks are good at marching or walking in the street. And seeing how those can come together to create this sea change and this shift that needs to happen.
Yeah, well, I was just going to touch something on the media aspect of it, because media really can play a huge role to make people informed and aware and educated about the problems. Unfortunately, corporate media is not doing that. And so one question is that why? Why aren't they doing it? Because, you know, we all know that like she said very rightly, that it's like really profit over people. So it really boils down to the debate of the 1% versus 99%, both in the United States and all across the world. Who are these people who are calling the shots? Why are they diluting all kinds of people's movements? And what are some of the problems that they're trying to sort of like push under the carpet, so that there is no comprehensive discussion on these issues. So that's one. So, and then the question is that what can we, the ordinary 99%, do to change the course of this debate and this discussion? Can we use social media? Can we use public access media? Can we talk to people knocking door to door, so that people are more informed and aware of these issues and the problems? And then the flip side of the coin is, what are the solutions? Are there solutions? Are there pragmatic solutions? Are there solutions that people have been able to accomplish in various parts of the world, including some parts here in the United States? Those are things that we need to be informed and educated about more and more and more, and spread the message across to the other sections of the ordinary 99%, so that there is like a broad-based movement about not just about climate change, but about the bottom line debate of the 1% versus 99%.
Well, I think something that you've seen in recent years with, for example, the Keystone XL pipeline, is that there's if you take the climate change debate and turn it into a hyperlocal issue, I think that you get coalitions that form communities that get involved that wouldn't normally get involved. When you talk about CO2 emissions, it's a very abstract idea that not a lot of people can grasp, and they just say, oh, whatever, why am I going to care about these tiny gases? I mean, big deal. But if you bring up, how climate change is going to affect their specific community, that's when I think you start seeing the biggest change. And I think we've seen that a lot with the Keystone. That went from, you have environmental groups that are pairing up with Republican farmers and ranchers, also pairing up with, Native American organizations. And you're seeing a lot of these very unlikely collaborations that are popping up to fight this one pipeline, and that's something that is starting to be replicated in other communities across the country. And I think that's one of the most powerful ways that we're going to, kind of force climate change onto the national scale. And you're also, if you have these hyper-local fights going on, you're also going to have little newspapers starting to cover the climate issue, because otherwise I think the climate debate has largely been kept in the national media, and it's been kept out of local papers. But a lot of people still get their news from their local papers and TV stations.
Yeah, I want to just underscore the importance of ethnic media, as Parther mentioned a little bit. I see our role is like both ways. Like, we bring the message to our community and educate them why climate change related to their personal life. But at the same time, if they have concerns of the environment in Chinatown, how do the authorities know? They don't read our newspaper, that's for sure, because we're in different languages. But what we can do is we can call the Department of Environmental Protection, we can call the Office of Emergency Operation, and just ask them questions. And look, this is what our community think, and this is what they worry about. What's your answers? A lot of times they would just ignore you for the first time when you call them, because you're ethnic media. If they don't answer your question, the next day their boss won't just go to their office to say, why don't you answer those questions? Because the bosses won't know. So what we need to do is we just have to really be persistent. That really make a difference. Like, you call them 10 times, 20 times, and eventually they give you the answer, and also they get the message, oh, this is a big issue. They really do care about this.
And persistence married with, like, a mass volume of people in addition to that.
Yeah.
And that persistence is greatly needed, obviously, and necessary in terms of our communities, because we don't have a whole lot of time, right? Climate change is not, hopefully, a conversation that we're going to be going 100 years into this and still talking about what climate change is going to look like in 100 years, because obviously we've just been told by Kat that we're going to be on the water in 100 years or so. So it's not just the government organizations that I think are also sometimes disconnected or not engaging our communities enough. There's also seems to be some kind of that disconnect also between the larger environmental movement, like the Sierra Clubs and or like the Earth Justice and the 350.orgs. How do we also as a community make sure that they involve us in every step of this conversation? Because as we've already noted, it's going to be mostly communities of color, not just locally, but also globally, that are going to be impacted first and probably hardest by climate change.
Right. Well, it's really the heart of the question is really the question of democracy. What kind of democracy we have? Do we really have a democracy that is of the people, by the people, or for the people, or do we really have a democracy which is not a democracy itself, but really a plutocracy, as many people have described? And that is exactly the problem. Unless you can really create a democratic process that is not just centered around voting every 4 years or every 2 years, but it is really centered around people's involvement and engagement with the political and economic and social processes. That is really where the movement has to be. And then you have this so-called left-right divide, which really hasn't helped us. This is really a philosophical discussion, and this is definitely not really the place to do that. But I think at the end of the day, you really have to find a way to bring the ordinary working class people together. both from the left and the right. Kat just mentioned how Republicans also have become a part of this anti-Keystone movement. I mean, it really have to, she's talking about the things that we've been talking about for a very long time, that you create issues and you engage people, ordinary working class people, both from the so-called left and so-called right, into the discussion and form a broad-based coalition. And that is the only way to create a true grassroots people's democracy.
I mean, if I may just inject one victory in this sort of like stage that we've talked about. I was intimately involved in a campaign in Puerto Rico regarding a gas pipeline, the building of a gas pipeline. It was sort of like a mini Keystone pipeline. It was going to be 92 miles long. It was going to go through the center of the island. The island is only 100 miles long, and this pipeline is going to be 92 miles long. It's going to go through all kinds of sensitive areas. It's going to displace like 200,000 people and put, also the lives at risk of thousands of people. And that was another great example, Partha, of people coming together from civil society, from the academic sector, from labor, from religious groups. They kept it on the issues. They kept the science really, pure and simple, and they engaged an organization called Casa Pueblo in one of the towns there. Really did the good job. We even hosted a solidarity group that we had here several times, working in conjunction with other groups that I then became aware of, like Food and Water Watch and Sane Energy, that are working on similar issues here, and that have not been as appealing to Latinos and other people as this particular issue, because it's hyper-local, like you've mentioned before, it's fighting this pipeline. And we were, thank God, successful in that effort in fighting that. But it was also a great example of how all these different sectors could come together to have a victory and to really get the message out there that this is something that's going to be affecting us all, regardless of our political stripes and persuasions.
And I really do think that, like, part of what you're saying in terms of engaging, so I call them like the big green organizations, is acknowledging that, so like around the Keystone Pipeline, around a lot of the issues related to climate change, there have been environmental justice and climate justice organizations and individuals that have much smaller budgets, much smaller staff, tireless people that are working in their impacted communities, kind of like talking and trying to leverage and collaborate with organizations like Sierra Club, Greenpeace, that have access to a lot more resources. And so I think that kind of like your question and what's happening, especially right now with the climate march, speaks to kind of like how people have really been working to be able to leverage the stuff that they've been doing, because they are sitting and living in their communities where people have been impacted, and really trying to figure out ways to be able to leverage their local media and then much larger media and many times even larger resources. And one example I think of that is there are a number of like kind of, I guess, broad-based coalitions. There's the Environmental Justice Leadership on Climate Change. There's the Climate Justice Alliance, that are collaborations of environmental justice organizations and climate justice organizations that work hyper-locally because they see those direct impacts. But they're also figuring out ways to be able to leverage those funds so that then you have people that are impacted showing up to the march, but also in other places. You have them showing up to really talk about how they've been impacted and how they're able to like kind of leverage this around the Keystone Pipeline. This happened around Hurricane Katrina. This happened also very recently in terms of organizations that did work with public housing and really leveraging money for HUD to actually be able and come to address many of the issues that happened because you had a bunch of temporary boilers in buildings. And so I think it's taking kind of like sometimes what we perceive and kind of like shifting that lens a little bit, because there's lots of ways, especially that organizations that are under-resourced and underrepresented kind of have to leverage the little bit of resources that they have to be able to put like a petition up, so that then the President's Council on Environmental Quality will then have a meeting to talk with environmental justice leaders about what are some of the things that could be created in terms of a national plan that can trickle down either to the local level, or even sometimes it may be the Bloomberg administration that convenes a group on community resilience with labor, community-based organizations, to be able to understand how they can make their climate resilience plan or Plan YC that much more efficient. It's also interesting because Plan YC initially when it came out didn't have anything really related to food. Food is a huge issue for New York City residents. It's a huge issue related to sustainability, but you saw, because of the coalitions between environmental justice groups, food justice groups, food banks and stuff like that, that during the next kind of like version of Plan YC, you saw a component of food. And so I think it's also us trying to figure out ways that we can leverage our ethnic media, leverage the local and national media to be able to have a bigger splash, because people are working really hard, and unfortunately sometimes the communications piece is the piece that gets dropped first. So I guess one thing that could come out of this is figuring out ways for like journalists like all of you to be able to partner with environmental justice or climate justice organizations so that we can like push forward for our goal, which I didn't even realize, I guess, as much until today.
Thank you, Olga. That's a perfect way to sort of like start segueing into our the end of our conversation here, because we are running out of time. But actually, what Olga said is perfect in terms of like, what are the next steps? What are we going to do to make sure that our voices are heard and respected in this process?
I feel like I just want to give you a suggestion that probably you should make a copy of this program and send it to all the big environmental organizations and let them know we exist and we're willing to participate.
Okay, that's a great suggestion.
There's a new diversity initiative that's been working to really build some of those bridges, and I could also be helpful in making that connection if possible.
Arthur, you'd like to chime in on that?
Yeah, sure. I think that, that's really, like I said before, it's an economic question for the 99%, but it's also a human rights question. The way people are living, not just in some godforsaken third world country, like in Somalia or Bangladesh or Haiti, but right here in the United States, and not just United States, here in New York City. Do people in power, Bloomberg administration, de Blasio administration, do they really care to know how poor people live in this city? In Harlem or in Jackson Heights or in Astoria or in some, Sunset Park, you name it. I mean, people are going through such a difficult time. Food, environment, employment, transportation, health, education, all these things are so interrelated. You cannot really separate one from the other. So there has to be a way to come up with some type of a democratic, comprehensive discussion for the future. And there has to be some organic, systemic solution that we can suggest. And there are suggestions out there.
In terms of getting the media to pay attention to this, I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think it's the local fights that are going to be the big thing. I think a lot of the times the mistake is if there's an issue, you want to go to the New York Times or the Huffington Post or some other similar national publication. But I think the power of local media is often it's forgotten, and I think that's one of the first places that people need to look. Yeah.
If you could offer a 1-minute sort of like solution or hopeful outcome of this People's Climate March, less than 1 minute, what would it be?
Well, the UN meeting is 2 days after, which are kind of the preliminary talks to get the discussion started for the big Paris talks next year. And so, I mean, the ultimate goal is to get the world leaders to realize just how many disparate interests want them to act on climate change. And so hopefully they'll listen.
Well, connect climate change and global warming to people's day-to-day problems. That's number one, so that people understand that this is really my personal problem. That's number one. And then to come up with a solution, you really have to create a platform that we can call people's democracy, nonviolent, peaceful people's democracy.
Have a press conference or at least send press releases to the ethnic media and ask them to place a story beforehand for the march so that to get people engaged.
Okay.
And of course, I'm going to say connect with, uphold, support a local community-based organization, because they also can be able to leverage, I think, some of the power and connections that we need in order to galvanize and bring this all together.
Will all of you be participating at the People's Climate March? Are you going to be
Covering it.
Are you going to be marching with particular groups? I know some of you are obviously covering it, but I'm sure it's going to have a presence as well.
Yeah, we act, and also if anyone's interested, we're having a teach-in on September 13th across from our office at 152nd and Broadway. I think it's from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m., so you should come out to that, or you can also march with us at the People's Climate March.
Do you all have a particular website or some other form of social media right now that's offering some really good suggestions or tips for people to follow up on?
Well, peoplesclimatemarch.org, they have a labor hub, and I'm particularly involved with the labor group, so I'll be marching and working with them.
And Inside Climate,
Yeah, insideclimatenews.org.
I know you could also find that on Facebook and other
Yeah, just
social
Google
media?
us. We're around.
Cool.
Okay.
We Act for EJ will follow you on Twitter.
Okay. Well, thank you all so much. This has been a great discussion, and I thank our guests for being here and sharing their story, advice, insight about this important issue. For Sidewalk News Roundtables, I'm David Galarza. Please contact Juana Ponce de Leon with any suggestions you may have about how to tackle this issue or for general questions and comments. Thank you for tuning in to Sidewalk News on Manhattan Neighborhood Network. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we have 1 minute left. Can we do a little promo? Okay, we're just going to have David Galarza say,
I can slouch you.
we have 1 minute left. We're going to do a little promo.
Okay.
We're just going to say, join the climate change march, Sunday, September 21st.
What's the PC? What is it? Peoplesclimatemarch.org.
Peoplesclimatemarch.org.
Okay.
I thought it was People's Climate.
Peoplesclimate.org/march.
Okay.
But either way is fine.